Hello and welcome to another episode of Another World of History. Today we're going to be talking about the Haitian Revolution. So world history is full of examples of revolts, rebellions and revolutions. In fact, some of the greatest pinnacles in history appear to have been revolutions in America and France, and protest and resistance in the name of justice, whatever that looks like, is often seen as something to be celebrated. Yet there's one social revolution that does not receive the same attention despite its singular success, the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution has been described as one of the great epics of revolutionary struggle and achievement. It's most significant today for its juxtaposition to the standard of the West as the ideal for liberty and equality. The Haitian Revolution, no matter which historiographical framework is used, has always been seen through the lens of Western history, rather than portraying the agency of the revolutionaries in the Caribbean context. So the question becomes, is liberalism the ultimate triumph? Haiti is part of the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean, along with the Dominican Republic. It was colonized by the Spanish, and then the French took over part of the island, which was known as Saint-Domingue, which made so much money for France from its plantation economy, particularly its sugar trade, and Haiti accounted for a quarter of all French overseas trade. There were white plantation owners, black enslaved people, marron, or formerly enslaved people who fled to the mountains, and then there were the gens de couleur, or the free people of colour, who were of mixed descent, often well educated in French. They were Catholic and denounced the voodoo religion originating in Africa. So they were in fact between whites and enslaved people in social class, and they weren't liked by either the whites or the enslaved people. You might hear the term affranchi, which was the French legal term for any ex-enslaved person, and importantly, the whites were significantly outnumbered. But well apart from class, there were also Creole and gendered relations in the colony. Black women became a threat to white women as they were forced to become competitors for male affection and could therefore hold power. So how did the revolution happen? The revolt began on 22nd August 1791 and ended in 1804 with the former colony's independence. Echoes of the rallying cry of the French Revolution that began in 1789, liberty, equality, fraternity, could likewise be heard in Haiti, which is why the Haitian Revolution has been called the inadvertent stepchild of the French Revolution. Resisting slavery was prominent in the Caribbean, even more than in the US. As David Howard comments, perhaps one of the most enduring legacies of colonialism is that of resistance. There are difficulties in finding accounts of resistance. Colonialism repressed resistance often violently. They tend to be written by colonialists who have a certain bias in maintaining the status quo, and we often have to read against the grain. For example, when lists of enslaved people belonging to estates were published, some were often listed as missing, which could mean that there had been a revolt. And there was struggle against slavery in cultural forms too. Even after the abolition of slavery, structures of resistance remained intact as subjugation in different forms continued. In fact, France did not have a mass anti-slavery movement, and no reforms were made until the 1830s. And there was nationalistic rhetoric expressed during voodoo ceremonies by priests and by women like Cécile Fatima, who prophesied the revolution. In late 1790, Vincent Ogé, a mulatto who had lobbied the Parisian Assembly for colonial reforms, led an uprising and was captured, tortured, and executed. But it didn't end there. In May 1791, the French revolutionary government granted citizenship to the wealthier gens de couleur, but Haiti's white population refused to comply with the law. Within 2 months, fighting broke out between Europeans and the gens de couleur, and by August, thousands of black enslaved people rose in rebellion. Women and marron were imperative to this fight, and women like Suzanne Belliard and Marie-Jean Lamartiniere fought in combat, while other women served as spies or wielded power through their sexualization. Added to this were the rival factions, some of which were supported by Spanish colonists in Santo Domingo or by British colonists from Jamaica. To quell the revolt, the French Assembly in Paris granted citizenship to all gens de couleur in April 1792. One of the most important figures of the revolution was Toussaint Louverture, a military leader and former slave born in Saint-Domingue. He was not involved in the revolution and supported the French until Britain, which had not abolished slavery, decided to get involved. In May 1801, Louverture had named himself Governor-General for life, with support from both the enslaved people and the gens de couleur. By this point, France was fighting European powers, wishing to reinstate the monarchy, and Napoleon Bonaparte attempted to restore the old regime and European rule by sending his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc. Louverture struggled for several months against Leclerc's forces before agreeing to an armistice in May 1802. However, the French broke the agreement and imprisoned him in France, and he died on April 7, 1803. Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Henri Christophe continued the fight against the French from 1802, following evidence that Napoleon intended to restore slavery in Saint-Domingue, as he had done in other French possessions. They defeated the French, and Marie Saint-Didier Basile would eventually retrieve Dessalines' dead body. Catherine Flon sewed the first Haitian flag in 1803, and finally, on 1st January 1804, the entire island was declared independent under the Arawak-derived name of Haiti. Many European powers and their Caribbean colonies ostracized Haiti, fearing the spread of slave revolts, but reaction in the United States was mixed. Slave-owning states did all they could to suppress news of the rebellion, but merchants in the free states hoped to trade with Haiti rather than with European powers. More importantly, nearly the entire population was utterly destitute. In the short term, the revolution was successful in its aims to liberate enslaved people and overthrow the colonial regime. Haiti emerged as the first black republic of the world, an inspiration to other enslaved peoples. But there were factors specific to Haiti that enabled the revolution's success. Punishment, force, and institutional control on enslaved people was underdeveloped, where plotting could take place. There were periods of internal disruption and external threat, like the Imperial War, which put stress on the plantation system. And there were times of the year where normal relations between classes were suspended. The geography of the island meant there were places for Marrons, the enslaved rebels, to flee and to regroup, and there was increasing estrangement between the colony and the metropole back in Paris. Two types of silence occur as a result of the apparent impossibility of the revolution, firstly through archival omission and secondly through trivialization, as evidenced by the failure of many historians of the French Revolution to even reference Haiti. Even now, a Google Ngram finds an enormous difference between scholarship on the French and American revolutions in comparison to the Haitian Revolution that essentially speaks for itself. But some historians also aptly argue that the revolution was, and remains, an unthinkable event, the implication being that history can be mere fiction with the power to make consumers of history believe in the past. The revolution destabilized European conceptualizations of race because it demonstrated that black people could successfully organize a revolution, liberate themselves, and defeat a white colonial power. Such a reading denotes the impossibility that revolution could happen in the first place. It also implies questions of what defines a revolution as opposed to a revolt. So the history of the Haitian Revolution is as much a story about its success in changing society as it is a story about the issues of narration, the often romantic and tragic lens through which we view revolution, and the way we obscure the way the sources of discontent or the obstacles to satisfaction are conceived and defined.